Welcome back to the Peak Property Performance Podcast. I am your co host, Drew Hall, and today's episode is going to be the following: why underwritten numbers hold up or fall apart when operational data, digital infrastructure, and asset value are hiding in plain sight. So, before we introduce our guest, just a quick reminder, as always, at the top of the show, share, subscribe the podcast. We're trying to get it out there, spread the word on the peak property performance movement, and honestly, change an industry is what we're hoping to do. We're not just pumping out these things for our benefit, but really for everyone's benefit. And I think the more stories that we share along the way with all of our guests, the more evident it is that there's a lot of room to grow and improve. So we're excited about that and the feedback that we're getting so far. So keep it up, and we appreciate that. And if you think that you would provide, if you're in earshot right now and you think you'd provide value as a guest here, or you know someone who would, we welcome CRE thought leaders from all stages of ownership and operation. So please reach out to us. And as always, the best way is right there at peakpropertyperformance.com. That's the absolute best way to get in touch with us. So without further ado, Bill Douglas, welcome.
Always a pleasure. I like doing these things more and more, Drew. The more shows we have, the more fun it gets.
Yeah. I agree.
And the first couple, I was nervous and edgy, and now it's like, oh yeah, we're going to record today. I like it. So today's guest is Mark Sinnett. Mark, say hello before I read your intro.
Yes, Drew, Bill, good afternoon.
Well, Mark is coming to us from Canada today. He's a principal with Avison Young and has spent roughly 25 years in commercial real estate brokerage with experience across major platforms, including CBRE, JLL, and Avison Young. So I was excited about this conversation because what makes Mark especially useful is that he's not looking at technology as a vendor or a systems designer. He's seeing it through transactions, what buyers underwrite, what gets treated as value, what gets discounted, and where the numbers either hold up or get repriced. God forbid they get repriced, right? So Mark, welcome to Peak Property Performance. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Drew. It's great to be on this podcast, and pretty excited to talk about this because to your point, in what we do on a day-to-day basis is really looking at the numbers, and so much of it comes down to you could say operating performance of a property, right? And I think it's often, I would say, potentially overlooked. And I would certainly say also, even on our end, we're probably a little bit guilty of it. The data is not consistent, and I think, yes, there's a component of it where data is, the data is local to the property, but that, how many owners, how many tenants, if you will say, are tracking all of their operating expenses across a portfolio, or are they, I think very often they're probably not. And so there is probably a ton of data that's, in a folder or in a line item somewhere, just treated as an expense. And it's never thought of as more than that. And I think even when we underwrite properties, it's oftentimes thought like that. So it's pretty fun to be on this today with you guys and kind of, seeing how we can think about it, less of maybe just an expense, but where we can go with it.
Oh, that's a perfect tee up to topic one. Mark,
Yeah.
seriously,
Thank you for that, by the way.
That's
Yeah.
a brilliant
Well,
tee up.
just glad to be here and talk about it.
Yeah. Well, so from your seat there, underwriting and selling major assets, let's talk about that specifically. What do you now look for operationally that owners may not realize that buyers are paying attention to?
Look, I mean, we could probably go through all, the major line items, but, let's start with an easy one, right? Which would be, let's say, the energy costs, and again, what I would say is that even on our side, like, we should, if you own the portfolio, you should be benchmarking, you want to call it your CAM, your OPEX, you should be benchmarking them across a portfolio to be able to see, which properties and what your average cost is. Right. I think most people will look at it on a property by property basis. But if one property, let's say the energy charge is $2 a square foot and the other one is $1.15, the question is why? And so that becomes kind of interesting. And we've had some clients that have gone through big energy programs where they've, retrofitted it. And then, it's been fascinating. Like, we had a property, just to think about it, we had a property where they did a couple $1 million. They put in a full digital infrastructure, everything was like, all the heating and cooling was fully controlled and fully automated. And, it was on an app. You pick it up, you look at it, you could see what the temperature was, how much air was blowing, and everything. And they received on top of it a subsidy from the government, to be more energy efficient. But again, it's local to that property, right? And I think where things can get interesting is, can you now fully centralize that where you're seeing it across your whole portfolio? But that's an example of where someone did kind of go and put data on something as simple as boilers, and I will tell you, it was way more complex than that. But the outcome for me was a little screen that showed, performance. And I think, thinking of this show, peak property performance kind of works for it, right?
All right. Yeah. So that's perfect. Yeah. An example of one particular building management system, like an HVAC, for instance, in one building. I mean, overall, what operational signals tell you that an asset is well run versus just well presented?
I think if you're thinking of a well-run asset, you're going to have an operator where the information on their building is easily accessible. And again, I might be going off tangent here or off topic, and you guys can kind of bring me back on. But we recently worked on an asset with a client where they were like, I hope the buyer is comfortable coming into the office to look at the leases. We haven't even scanned them. I was like,
Wow.
A
Okay.
little analog.
I was like,
Discount. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, look, again, you think of that and you're like, okay, if the leases aren't digitized, right? And maybe I'll go a step further. It's like, you think of a building, and that, let's say a building has 100 different leases that have been written, over the last 20 years. The clauses are not going to be all consistent. Right. Article 5 is not always going to be the sublease clause. So, how is your data? And again, as I said, it can be in anything. Like you could make efficiencies in just how you administer your lease documents, and where not just you save the information, but how you save the information. Oftentimes, I think real estate, somebody had said it once, where it's interesting. It's like probably the only industry where now it takes longer to build. Everything else has increased in efficiencies. I think real estate is the only one where it's kind of gone somewhat backwards. And there is some, realities where regulations have gotten stricter, and, how you build is more secure and all of that stuff. But we just don't really see, it's one of the few places where you really see efficiencies. And so I think going digital, is where I think there is a ton of value that can be created. And so I could give you like an easy story of where, missing an option could cost millions of dollars, right? Like if you forget to send, again, you want to think about it like another quick example. We've had a client who forgot to send a, rent increase on time. And that that hits on the bottom line. So there's just so much, like you can go line by line. Again, I would say here's a basic one in Canada. Like, every fall we kind of have to renegotiate snow removal contracts. I don't know that anyone is, running a historical to see what it was previously, and understanding, where the ups and downs are, if it's more or less from the previous year. Where does that information get saved? Where is that contract? And that's just on the expense side. And then the performance of the building, which might be more where we should be thinking, or, having a discussion on, probably one of the best buildings that we had. We sold it about a year and a half ago now, almost 2 years ago now. What was really made it stand out was just they had put everything, not to say digitized, but everything was electronic. So you walked into the building, facial recognition, so you keyless entry, everything was fob, which made it super easy, right? Like again, just tenants moving in and out. You don't have to chase them for keys, right? It's seamless. That was a big thing. Access to the elevators, you can control what floors people went on. That was, they even went all the way to the extent of they had what's called dispatch elevators. So, you're not stopping and everyone's going like 7, 8, 9, 10 floor. You press the floor you're going on, it tells you which elevator to go. They then built a app so that, for some of the common areas, let's say if I wanted to use they had like a cinema room and I wanted to reserve it, I could easily reserve it online. which made it kind of a seamless thing. And, so the premium on that was that you really did and really could build a community feel to the complex, right? Messages were sent. And then, even they had gone to the extent where, they could track again, because it was all through the app, you had a repair request. So you put it in. And then you could see, you were the third in line for, let's say, if there was a repair request. They were then able to check to see, had you paid your rent before they go and repair? And if not, they would tell you like, hey, so, it meant less people on site, less friction. It meant and it really, what we saw was, I would say, to say it simply, is that it made the tenant sticky, right? So, a tenant in that building is thinking like, geez, I moved to the next building. It's back to fumbling with keys, I got to go knock on the janitor's door if there's a service need, like that's the old school way, right?
That's what I was thinking. Literally, was like almost like a sense of belonging. Like, yeah, these are my people here. The more cohesive those systems are, the more you feel like a part of a process that really works. And you use the word community. I was thinking the same thing. You're part of a community that's kind of performing better than most others out there. So you're right, leading to sticky client. That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, no, I was going to ask one more question here on this topic, like in terms of the operating data itself, from the buyer's perspective. Do you see that buyers are asking better questions about systems and operating data during their diligence?
I think more and more they are, and are recognizing more and more, like I said, when everything is kind of easily accessible and at their fingertips. And I think that's still like, we still have a long ways to go. Even when we ask clients for information and it comes in very, very piecemeal. Like the expression I like to say is like someone shows up and gives me a shoebox with paper in it. It's not that bad anymore, but sometimes it really, it really is a little bit all over the place, or information is lacking, the backup isn't there. And I think at a really simple level, it's having solid information that's easily accessible creates confidence. And when you think of the entire investment space, investor sentiment is really based on confidence. So if I feel like this is a good investment where, I'm going to make potentially money, that's typically because I'm confident in the decision that I'm going to make. So, bad information or contradictory information or information that's lacking kind of erodes confidence and creates doubt and uncertainty. And so, if we can't substantiate something, or, if we have to start putting in a ton of assumptions because we can't back it up with anything, it's not going to make for a smooth transaction.
Well, that's a perfect transition because we've been talking so far on the show about additive NOI, additive asset value. So not to be the Debbie Downer, but I wanted to ask you about when missing digital infrastructure or data becomes a discount. So where have you seen a property get repriced, get discounted, or underwritten more conservatively because the data or the digital infrastructure simply wasn't there?
Again, I think where it'll show up I don't think it shows up like as a perfect line item, but where you'll kind of see it on two ends is you're basically going to see a weaker NOI. That's like the headline. So, you can think of a building, let's say, that is, again, going back to it as a basic that offers Wi-Fi throughout. Well, you can probably ask for a higher rent, right? Because it's included. We find more and more in the apartment space, turnkey. Person wants to come in, they don't want to engage in all the services, the utilities, the phone, the cable, the Wi-Fi. They kind of just want to go in, drop their bags, and are willing to pay. And oftentimes you can get bulk pricing for that stuff. So there's an opportunity there. So you'll kind of see at that point where you're charging a bit higher rent than your peers and the tenant enjoys kind of life, right? And you can usually get it at a bulk discount. So I'd say that's kind of like one example. I think other places where, we're starting to see it more and more is just on the efficiency of the operating expenses, kind of going back to it where, again, some of the basic stuff like utilities are going to be higher because you have an outdated, whether it's boiler or, chiller on the roof that's, not running optimally, so I'd say those are kind of two. And then, again, if we get into more complex properties, right? Like, we sold recently a cold storage facility. again, part of it was built in the 70s, part of it was built in the early noughts, like in around 2002. And then you look at the state of the art one that the client had moved into, it's night and day, and how much of a difference we might sell an older vintage 1970s for, we'll give some round easy numbers for $150 a square foot, and a brand new one costs 600 and is worth $600 a square foot. And they're doing the same thing, right? They're just cold storage, but state of the art, everything is optimized, everything is running efficiently, temperature controls are way better, and just the whole infrastructure.
So rather than talk about a specific system, I love the fact that you brought an example outside of the typical office or apartment market. So thank you for that. But how should owners think about digital infrastructure before they go to market instead of getting punched in the face by a buyer that finds the gap?
And look, I'll think of another quick one too. So, more and more what we see in new buildings, I'm sure you guys see this because, this is like the new standard is, now in a new apartment building, there's like literally like a digital box, right? In the old days, you'd have the wire running along the quarter round.
Mm-hmm.
And now everything is centralized, and all your cable, your Wi-Fi, it's all in the right place, right? So that's again an example of where we're starting to see buildings are being built a little bit smarter. So again, I think the main thing is if I'm looking at a current owner today, what we're focused on, kind of looking with them is like, bottom line, how can you integrate not just data but data infrastructure to make the property operate more efficiently? And a lot of that stuff operating more efficiently, I'm going to sound a little bit repetitive. Some of it is basic stuff, keyless entry. Like it costs to set that up, right? You got to set up a Wi-Fi and everything. But think about it. You want a tenant calling you at 8 at night, and it always happens on a long weekend, right, guys? It's always
Of
going to happen on
course.
a long weekend. I lost my keys. Remote access, easy, done, right? Or, sorry, I got to leave my long weekend vacation, cottage, to drive back into town to get the spare key.
Yeah, it's a game changer. Absolute game changer.
So, we tell clients, it's like, if you want to hit the high end, like to go, Bill, maybe to go to your question, you show up at a closing, here's 100 keys, here's all the leases in a box, right? You think of it, the transition right over. So now they got to go into their system. They got to like enter every line by line, like the new tenant's name, the billing address, blah, blah, blah. That's how it was done, right? Or you show up and you're basically like, here's your password.
That's the difference between having an aggregated data lake and having disparate systems. We talk about data silos all the time. So what I hear you talking about in real life is siloed data. Like we keep talking about access controls and HVAC controls, building management systems, but it goes on and on and on. These buildings you're talking about have 12 to 15 systems, and you're just talking about the ones the tenant directly touches. There's a plethora that impact the tenant experience that the tenant doesn't actually see. You mentioned elevator controls. That's another one, lighting controls, for instance. There's controls around the swimming pool and all the common areas and all the amenities, et cetera, et
When are
cetera, et
they
cetera.
accessible? But again,
Yeah.
again, if you go back to the basic, like a simple building, if without any of this stuff being, kind of centralized or put, on a platform electronically, the transition from a seller to a buyer means physically handing everything over. Physical copies of leases, physical
And that's a
copies of
discount. If I'm
keys.
the buyer, that's a discount.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, yeah. And
Mhm.
it's a discount just because, again, it's also more costly. You're probably gonna have an extra janitor because, or you're gonna have more on-site staff, or as I said, like, you're gonna have missed a renewal period and you forgot to send a notice of rent increase. Like, it's leakage. If I could say
Yeah.
it that way, things will leak, fall through the cracks. You will miss things. Whereas, again, in an ideal world, you show up, here's the passwords for these 2 3 systems, or here's the password for one global system, and the property is now in the other person's name. And the one building that we did last year was almost that. They literally transferred over the domain, behind the platform that they had developed behind the scenes. And the new buyer was able to come in, and basically, the tenant didn't see any difference, and everything was available. Even like sending the rent checks, right? Again, how do you send out that notice? Well, if you have a digital app, here's the notice. Or you go back the old way where it's a letter at every door.
Well, yeah, so like if we think about those two realms, so to speak, the tenant convenience portion and then the operating systems that we've been talking about, I'm just curious, how you see that. It's almost not that these things have become blurred, but there's just so much more possibility these days because of the potential for all of these systems to participate in data flows, which means that if you can capture that data. Yeah.
I think tenants are more demanding it and expecting it, and they'll notice it when they show up in a property, that kind of doesn't have it. I don't know how else to say that. Going outside again, same thing like an office building, right? Again, you can think of an office building. I think people want to have access to their office building at all times, and so you got to find a way to be able to set up, again, the infrastructure to be able to allow that access seamlessly. But you also have to keep the building secure. So, again, with the right optimization, you can achieve that. And if you want to optimize your building, by the way, let's take an office building that's right next to, a sports arena. So you've got daytime crowd where you've got your typical office employee going, and then you got nighttime for the event. So you got to manage that flow, right? So again, old school way, let's just put a parking attendant. New school way, and then can you get granular where
Oh, like
when to
field, like
charge,
on the
right?
field.
It's a playoff game. I'm going to charge a premium. Yeah.
We've had a lot of success with that at client sites, finding thousands a month just in dynamic parking pricing.
That's like definitely an easy one for office. And like we have a building we're selling, and they kept the building as monthly.
That
They
the
haven't
goal of
opened it up,
golf
and they're
is to
and
play
they're
less
right
golf.
next to, a main entertainment district. And we keep telling them, like, you got to do it on the weekends, and it's like, but again, it was actually the infrastructure. It's like you got to put in, the you have to put in, sorry, we use a word in French, but you have to put in the infrastructure to kind of like get it automated.
Yeah,
It's
it's a
obstacle, but
silly
it's
way
like
of talking about
going back to it,
efficiency
when
is the
we're on the
goal in
market,
golf.
we're
Yeah, yeah.
telling clients, like,
All right,
this is
Mark.
a
So
need.
I know it's
This
a deep one. It's
building
a deep one.
lacks this. You put this
Are you an
in,
early
and now
bird
your
or a night
revenues
owl?
will appreciate, right? So we try now more and more to identify these weaknesses in buildings to, show to owners. And I think a lot of them are becoming more and more what you guys are talking about.
Yeah.
Oof. Yeah. Touchy subject, right? Um,
We do have some lawyers in future episodes. Everybody listening, we have a couple lawyers that are going to come on and share risk and give advice, not advice, but share experiences and around this topic. So we don't have to dive that deep in it, Mark, from a legal perspective, but do it from an owner, from a seller or a buyer
Yep.
perspective.
I think and I mean, again, it's not unsimilar to, thinking about this from a just common sense perspective. You don't have to share necessarily people's personal information, names. Like, again, we receive a lot of digital, like, we'll receive rent rolls. It doesn't have to have the full name of the person on it and their date of birth and all of their background. That stuff probably should not be optimized to a certain extent or used as part of, like, data aggregation or whatever you want to call it. So I think it's aware what is like, what rent are they paying, what's the size of the space, that stuff. It's generic. So, again, like, we'll, if I could again think of a simple thing, a person, we just put tenant and, the suite that they're in. So I think you do have to ensure that information that you're going to use, like personal information. So I'm just going to share my opinion. I guess personal information should not be used in you optimizing, but the data, which is, like I said, the square footage that
Thank
the
you, Mark.
person occupies and the term of the lease and the rent. I mean, that's just, to me, not personal. That's all I can say. So I think it's ensuring it from that perspective that, and again, like when we market stuff, we ask for confidentiality agreements. It's actually something we're quite sensitive about. We'll get calls sometimes from outside brokers and they'll be like, hey, send me the information. We're like, well, we don't know who you represent. And what if it's a competitor who wants to take, just see the rent roll to know when the tenants' leases are expiring so they can go poach the tenants. So, I think, again, going back to it, it's like before you use the information, you always think through like who's going to get to see this. That would be my opinion. Right.
Right. Don't collect it. Don't distribute it. Don't monetize it. Anything personal, we just don't.
Yeah.
We we will collect a lot of data, but as we've said, Drew, on the show, you've said it, I've said it. When we talk about data, we're talking about data generated by the property, not data from the tenants. Like
Yeah.
lease occupancy and rates, you take the PII out of it is valuable. Like that's density, that's turn and churn and vacancy and set things
Yeah.
that impact NOI. But nothing that tenant does on any of those systems is valuable data. So we just don't collect it. Much more companies did it that way too. Because I have sons that are tenants and I don't want their data mined, you know?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, look, also, I think I think there's a clear, a second red line is like, I'm not taking the data that I get from clients, then turning around and selling investment reports to another client with that data, right? Like, we're using the data that's given to us specifically for the reason it's given to us, which is like, hey, I'd like to know what my property is worth, and so from that perspective, we're using the data they've given us for the purpose that they've asked us to use it. I think that's also another key point is, why do you have access to this data and what is the intent of it? I think if I was to turn around and then use, like I said, to go back to that evil example, take that data and then now go see the neighbor and say, hey, I'll sell you the rent roll that I just got, for $50 so you can go poach the tenant. Well, now I've crossed probably the ultimate red line. But I think there are some people that, kind of do think that they've got all this data and now they can go see a client and say, we've got data that would be, I mean, I don't know if you guys get it, but I get an email every day about like, they'll sell me lists of every,
oh yeah.
family office and this thing and that thing. And you're just like, but weren't you like 2 minutes ago emailing me asking for data and now you're repackaging the data you asked me for and selling it back to me?
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the reason we all look at our Ring camera before we answer the door.
Exactly.
Well, we talk extensively on this show about using data and digital as a strategic tool in commercial real estate. So let me shift a little bit and talk about data that lowers risk and reveals NOI. So, Mark, how does clean historical operating data reduce the need for conservative reserves or broad assumptions in underwriting?
I mean, I think like 100%. And that's, as I said at the beginning, is like the cleaner your information is, the more accurate your information, the more I can get someone to underwrite sharper, to say it really simply. And otherwise, and I've had clients like literally, we've had institutional investor clients call us up and say, hey, man, if you don't get me that information, I got to put in like a really big reserve and it's not going to help the bid that you want, or it's not going to help me put in, get the pricing that you're looking for. And it comes back to, again, if we have clean data, clean information, if we have, again, a property where, the client has confidence that, again, they can run it without headache, and running it without headache, again, I think goes back to like, again, back to the simple one, like I lost the keys and you got to send somebody to open the door, where you could do this obviously today completely offsite. And again, we toured another building, and I would tell you, like, where they can take it to kind of next level. They have a rooftop pool that is heated now 24/7. So even in the middle of minus 30 degrees Celsius, so really cold, there's an outdoor pool that, the tenants and guests can use. This is for a hotel. Again, if you don't have that thing optimized, if you're not, one, checking for the maintenance of it and having that data to ensure that it's running properly, heated properly, that thing is gonna be a big NOI suck, right? But it's a modern building. It's less than 6 years old. So the data, the technology, the infrastructure, all of it is in place for them to have been able to do that. And it's a phenomenal selling feature, I could tell you.
Is there a way you could put a value on or share an experience around what a clean property data lake, data warehouse, data repository, whatever? It's a data lake, but I don't want to get techie on the show. What a clean property data repository would be worth in a transaction?
I've never thought of it that way. So I'd really just have to like shoot from the hip. But what I would say, and if I could look at it a very simple metric, which is like price per square foot, which is kind of like to me, the ultimate apples to apples, if you will. I think it could add like anywhere between 10 and $40 a square foot. And again, I don't know that it'll appear again, and that where and why I say it's just a guess is I don't know that it appears anywhere as a line item per se, where you see the exact dollar per square foot value. But I think what it allows to do is it creates a higher revenue potential and a lower expense. So when you look at the gap between the two, and I go back to that example of where it's really dramatic is if you take something that requires 24/7 temperature control, like cold storage facility, and you look at what the new state of the art ones require, and you look at an ancient one, and, we sold one for 160 a square foot. A new one was built for 600 a square foot. So it kind of tells you the difference. And yes, you can say construction costs and all those things, but what was in the construction of it was really just this thing had to be fully monitored, fully controlled. And I think that's slight, if I could say, I don't want to say an extreme example, but it's just, a cold storage facility has to have 24/7 temperature control, 24/7 operations. Even the systems that they use, but by the way, in there, it's usually now done with, I think it's ammoniac is what it's called. And that's a type of fluid that has to be monitored with a 24/7 security system. It's potentially toxic. So you have to really know what you're doing. So that gives you an example of where, if you're talking some of these more sensitive properties, you're really going to see the delta from what an ancient one, which is basically almost considered non-functional, to fully modern.
Well, the same premise applies to apartments and office buildings and hospitality and student housing, and senior living, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Well, $40 a foot that's a lot. Like even a 10 is a lot. So we've heard people say $250,000 ad transaction just because the data was clear. Like
Oh
somebody
yeah.
paid extra because it reduced risk. I like your dollars per foot better because it's obviously scalable instead of just being flat.
And again, I think it's going to be very variable, and it's also going to be how much. But absolutely. Like I think the other way I like to think about it, and I thought this was really interesting. Someone to mention is you think of where, and I think it's kind of where we're headed is that unfortunately climate change is happening. And not to get into the political side of it, but if you look at on the realistic side of it, and this is speaking from more of a colder city, being up here in the north, a building without AC built in the 1970s, not an issue. There might have been 2 weeks in the middle of the summer where it was a little bit tough, right? And the question that was asked to me by a client once, or that was said to me by a client once actually, was, in another 25 years, does a building that doesn't have AC, is it even habitable anymore? And so you think of all these buildings, and we have a lot of buildings that were built in the 70s and 80s in our market, and you think of how many of them are actually going to even be still habitable. And so you think through retrofitting all of those, so you think about the cost, it could be down to zero, right? If certain infrastructure, and again, I go back to, I think, well, I understand HVAC is a mechanical thing, but I recently installed one, and the thing doesn't turn on without a digital engineer who has to call up the main company to get the whole thing working. And it is not a simple heat pump anymore, guys. which you probably know. And so, some buildings might go down to a value of zero if the technology and the data and the hardware, I guess is what it's called, and infrastructure is not put in place to handle all of these systems. Great piece of life advice. I recently was asked that by an intern on my team. I think the one thing I think what I told him, so maybe I'll repeat it here. I mentioned to him, I just said, look, say yes to the opportunity. Don't be fixated on what you think you want or the goal that you have to have. Sometimes an opportunity will come up and you may not end up, like I think what I was trying to say to him was like, I've seen people, say, I have to have this job. I need to get to this level by this date and stuff. And someone offers them an opportunity that they turn around and say, oh, that's not where I want to go and walk away. So I think be open to opportunities. You never know where it'll take you, and oftentimes the opportunity will present itself, and sometimes we may choose it or turn it down because we felt at the time it wasn't what we were looking for. So that would be one. That was the advice I gave someone on our team.
Well, we're going to shift from advice to practice. So, what's one habit or practice that consistently makes you more effective?
Don't accept no, I guess, or actually, again, this goes back to said in from a more senior broker, and I'm probably not going to say it right, but I liked it. He called it persistent persistence or something like that, and he just kind of said he was persistent. And I do think to a certain extent it is a lot of this is just being and I'm in sales, so, and I think that's maybe where I'm thinking of this, but I think it applies for most things. You got to really just accept it's not going to work on the first time. And maybe just to finish on that, like what I always tell anyone who's starting in our business, and it was said again by another senior person, he said, you're 700 no's away from a yes. And, when you think Federer gave, I think a graduation speech, and he, explained how many times he was at the time the best in the world and how many times he actually lost. His loss rate was, you know, I mean, baseball, you're a great hitter at a 300. It means you strike out 7 out of 10, right? I think basketball, you're 40% free throw, maybe 50 is good. I tell everyone it's yeah, from the field. I tell everybody it's why I don't like golf because it counts your mistakes. I said I like the sport where I can miss the net 7 times and then I shoot and score, and that's what they count as the points and the goals I scored. And they don't count the misses, where I find golf, it's the opposite. They count every stroke, so every mistake. But yeah, persistence, persistent. I like them.
Uh, it's an excuse for a good walk with friends.
Yes, that I will give it, is just the nature of the sport, but no, I would say I think you just got to accept that it's, if it doesn't work the first time, you try again. Oh, I used to be a night owl. I have young kids, so I've turned into an early morning. And truthfully, again, it kind of goes back to that. It's like one of the fun things about the job that I have, and what I realized, which is great, is to a certain extent, I'm never off. Again, and I think the secret to this job, if I could say, is again, this was something, a piece of advice that was told to me by a lawyer once. He said, there's no such thing as the best contract. He goes, if you're a lawyer and you think you're going to write the absolute best contract, that's just never going to exist. He says, but what clients pay you for is be there, availability. When they need you, unfortunately, you have to be available. And he goes, that's the difference. And how I look and think about that is that to a certain extent, I'm never necessarily off, but that doesn't mean that I am stuck at my desk, or that I can't go see my kids play, or I can't, I'm going to go after this and coach my kids' baseball game. But it does mean that if, at 9 p.m. I have to respond to an email after the baseball game, I'll do it. So being super responsive, I think if you're in the service business, and I think more and more we're all in the service business, everybody has choices. And, it's not always that you're going to be able to deliver the best product, but I think what clients rely on is that you're responsive, and when they need you, they can reach you.
So, speaking of need you, Mark, how can our listeners contact you should they choose? I mean, we'll put all this in the show notes as well, but tell everybody the best way to reach you.
I say the simplest is by email. Again, being super responsive, I'll pretty much respond to every email. Phone sometimes a little bit harder, but my email is my name, mark.sinnett at avisonyoung.com. And then, as I said, super responsive, will always answer back. And then, phone, there's a address where I can also be reached, but like even voicemails, people don't really listen to voicemails anymore. So I'd say by email is the easiest.
Mark, appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. Thank
Yeah.
you. And thank you, all our listeners. And as Drew said at the beginning of the show, please like, subscribe, follow, share it, email it to somebody, put your hand up. I want to be on the show, or I know somebody that would add value, or I'd love to hear from that person. Give us ideas about topics or guests. We appreciate it. And thanks for helping us further the movement about using data and digital to improve your commercial real estate property and portfolio. Thanks again, everybody. Catch you on the next episode. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Drew.